You can start though. Then.
Okay, excellent. So, welcome everyone. This is the 75th session of CIJA's monthly seminar series, organized by the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul, Sabahattin Zaim University. Through these seminars, SIGA brings together scholars, experts, and the public to engage with pressing global issues and provide critical perspectives. So, thank you for joining today's webinar, Killing the Truth, Israel's Targeting of Palestinian Journalists and Western Media's Complicity. I'm Paul Salvatore, journalist and senior producer, and have the honor of moderating the webinar, again hosted by the Center for Islam and Global Affairs in Istanbul. Joining us is a panel of four distinguished guests. Um, Palestinian lawyer and editor Laura Albas, lawyer and analyst Diana Boutu, executive producer of Al Jazeera English Fault Lines, Leila Al-Arian, director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, Professor Sami Al-Arian. So each guest is invited to speak for 10 to 15 minutes on the focus of the webinar, namely the woeful disregard by Western media to cover the dangers faced by Palestinian journalists, over 250 of whom have been killed by Israeli forces in Gaza since October 2023 alone. The longstanding racism underlying this disregard and what the international community can do to effectively contest this. And since this is a webinar following the guest presentations, there will be a discussion among the panelists where they'll have the opportunity to respond to one another's presentation. And of course, I humbly look forward to facilitating that part as well. So you're right. So the webinar should about an hour. So if it goes to about an hour, the remainder would just be for that discussion. But I believe the webinar is scheduled till 5:30 Istanbul time, PM. Okay, so without further ado, I invite Laura Albas to give the first presentation.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I just have some slides to share. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a Palestinian journalist. I was based in DC for about 6 years before I left and moved to South America. And I've been looking into Western media bias, specifically US media bias, for several years. I've been studying it. I've been subjected to it, whether by Israeli lobbies that go after Palestinian journalists or journalists who are trying to report the truth. And so I'm really honored to be here to speak about this, especially with Leila and Diana and Professor Sami. I want to start a little bit with why should U.S. media bias and coverage matter to global audiences? I gave a similar talk in South America last month, and I thought, why is this crazy girl talking about America when we have other things to address? It's because in many ways, whether we like it or not, national media organizations in the United States have positioned themselves as pillars of information production, that many media organizations all around the world, not all of them, but a lot of them, that are under-resourced or perhaps underdeveloped when it comes to international media coverage. So they don't cover the Middle East specifically, or they don't cover Palestine specifically. They seek the information that the New York Times or CNN or the BBC may produce, and they use it as fact. They translate it into their own language. They use it as a reference in their own reporting, without going beyond doing their job as reporters, right? They're just taking it. New York Times said it must be true. Let's move on. And so that language that Western media organizations are using, the existing pro-Israel bias, the censorship, the editorial restrictions that have gone through in order to produce a piece of news about the genocide in Gaza, for example, then translates and transcends these borders and becomes the propaganda that gets produced and shared with other audiences. So that's why, if we're not in the US, we have to care about media bias that exists in the United States. That is one part of it. The other part of it is obviously that these media organizations have manufactured consent for genocide. And I think both Leila and Diana are going to also be speaking about this. How did they manufacture consent? Many ways. They've dehumanized Palestinians, they've omitted facts, they've fabricated narratives, they've parroted Israeli propaganda and used it as fact. They delayed the truth if they didn't omit it. And so in many ways, when they report something in the beginning, 2 days later, they correct it, but the damage had already been done. And I'm going to mention a few examples here from the start of the genocide. But before I do that, I want to recognize that Israel has killed at least 280 journalists and media workers in Gaza since the genocide began. And these are numbers that are taken from both Al Jazeera and the Gaza Media Office, combining fixers, cameramen, journalists, anybody who works in the media sphere in Gaza. This is insane that we have gotten to this point of this many journalists that have been targeted, assassinated, killed, threatened, without any accountability, without a finger lifted to protect them, without anything being done, just them being targeted and killed. This is deliberately done by the Israeli regime, specifically in northern Gaza. How many of us have been hearing news coming out of northern Gaza? Is it in the same frequency as it was before? No, it's not, because they've killed a lot of journalists that are there. But even today, how much news are we reading? How much information are we getting from Gaza today as compared to October 2023? The type of targeting that is taking place is going beyond just threatening the lives of the journalists, but also isolating them. I have friends in Gaza who regularly report from there, who tell me that they've had to separate from their families. People don't approach them. People try to avoid talking to them or being near them because they're afraid that these journalists are going to be targeted, and thus the people around them are going to be targeted as well, and they're going to be killed. And what ends up happening isn't that groups of journalists or associations or countries are calling for the protection of journalists. Maybe recently they started calling for the protection of journalists because we got to a point where how much more can you deny that there is a deliberate targeting of journalists in Gaza? But instead, a lot of the calls that are coming out are let international journalists in, as if the problem is a lack of information because there's nobody reporting, rather than a lack of information because Israel is blocking communication, killing journalists, and just blocking anybody who's trying to show anything to the outside world. And this is not just Israel doing this to Palestinian journalists, but also big tech companies like Instagram, Meta, Twitter, etc., trying to suppress news that is coming out of Gaza. And so we've ended up in a situation where instead of demanding that journalists in Gaza must live, that Western media considers them now unreliable in many instances, as if their journalists alone can be the ones who can report the truth. But when we think about that, and before I jump into that, just going back a little bit, this targeting also, the most prominent example of targeting of journalists is actually in October of last year, when Israel publicly released the names of 6 journalists with Al Jazeera, accusing them of being terrorists. And they have killed at least 2 of them, Hussam and Anas, Hussam Shabat and Anas Sharif, and they have also injured at least 1. I tried to find information about the other 3, but I couldn't find online. But they have deliberately targeted these journalists. Anas Sharif is the one of the most recent journalists that have been targeted and killed. The entire world has seen his killing, and he was positioned in north of Gaza. And right now, Israel has re-entered the north of Gaza, committed countless massacres, destroyed countless towers. It's a complete blackout in the north. There is hell taking place in the north of Gaza right now. With everybody this is a picture from the vigil for Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Palestinian journalists who were killed in Gaza. This was in Washington, D.C. But with everything that has taken place in the targeting of journalists, you would think people would step up right? So what they stepped up to do instead is to call journalists into Gaza, international journalists. And this is something Diana will dig deep into. I won't touch on it right now. I'll just recommend this article by the public source in Beirut, which talks about how international journalists who embedded with the Israeli military to tour southern Lebanon after Israel attacked there, how they produced content and news that was complete propaganda for Israel, complete state propaganda. And what is going to happen, what we know is going to happen, is that any journalist, international journalist who would enter Gaza would be only permitted to do so if escorted by the Israeli military. This is something the Prime Minister of Israel has said. He said, we're going to escort them in. Even everybody who's calling for this, including nations, they're calling for the entry of journalists. Nobody's calling for the stopping of the genocide. This article really dives deep into how the BBC specifically and other media organizations, first of all, did not disclose that their reporting came from a tour of embedding with the Israeli military, and they also omitted information and decontextualized it in the attacks in southern Lebanon. So we expect to see that in Gaza as well. But I want to share a few examples, I guess, from the beginning of the genocide. So a lot of these photos are from protests in Washington, D.C. when I was there. I just share them for a visual aid. But the media parrots propaganda. What does that look like? The most prominent example we can think of from the beginning of the genocide is when they said that there are 40 beheaded babies, that Hamas beheaded 40 babies. And when people tried to ask, give us more information, where did this information come from? And then Joe Biden, the former US president, said that he saw the images of these babies, and the White House had to come out and say he did not actually see these images. We do not have any of these images available. And the CNN reporter who initially said it on air had to come out and apologize for defending the Israeli claim that there were 40 beheaded babies. I remember watching the news. The day after she had apologized, a different reporter repeated the claim. It really didn't matter. Within that same time frame, there was a press conference held by an Israeli military spokesperson that a lot of journalists attended on Zoom, and some Palestinian journalists were on there as well. And when journalists started pressing him, saying, "Can you give us evidence? Can you answer these questions?" The Israeli military spokesperson said, "Evidence doesn't matter. This doesn't matter." But nobody reported, out of that press conference, nobody reported that this exchange even took place, except maybe some movement organizations like Mondoweiss and others. The media also fabricates information. This is something maybe my colleagues will also touch on, but this story that had taken place screams without words in the New York Times, a long-form journalism piece by a person who is not a journalist. The writer was not a journalist, the person who had reported this. They had basically used one Israeli family's story to say that Hamas had committed rape, had committed sexual violence. A deep dive into this story shows, and I would recommend reading an analysis by a scholar, Rand Abdel Fattah. It was published in the Institute for Palestine Studies, on the weaponization of rape in service of Israeli propaganda, on the other hand. A deep dive into this shows that, first of all, the writer is affiliated with the Israeli military, number one, so there's that bias. Number two, she admitted later on that she found no evidence of cases of rape that had taken place, but they still used the story anyway. Family members of the individual that is mentioned in the story came out and said that they were misled. They thought this was going to be an obituary, and that in fact the person mentioned was not rape. The media invented it and misled them. And then the person who had filmed the footage, some of the footage that is mentioned in this story, said that she was pressured to provide this footage in service of Israeli propaganda. And beyond these points. Within the New York Times itself, they have a podcast that was going to do a story on this particular article, and the journalists themselves working on the podcast found that there are inconsistencies. There's no evidence for things here and things there. And even they raised this issue internally and said, hey, we can't produce this podcast because we can't verify this information. And so they had to actually not do that episode. And every time people would press the New York Times on retracting, on correcting, on issuing an apology, anything, they would just dismiss. They don't care. The media dehumanizes Palestinians, not just Palestinians, but also Lebanese and Syrians and everybody that they attack in the Middle East. This is when they had the pager and walkie-talkie attacks, and when they did the pager and walkie-talkie attacks in Lebanon. The headlines and the articles were drooling over how amazing Israeli technology is. It's getting its mojo back. What a great success this technology was in this attack. What a stunning blow. Imagine if this had taken place in Sweden or Switzerland or Ukraine or I don't know where. Would these be the headlines we're seeing, or would it be terrorist attack in I don't know where? There's completely no empathy. There's just, it's almost like these media organizations are serving as PR agencies for Israel. And maybe just the last example that I'll be sharing is the most recent one, when Israel struck the Nasser hospital 4 times. So initially it was a double tap, so twice, and then the BBC found footage that it was actually struck 4 times. They killed at least, I think, 22 people, including 5 journalists there. Out of these 5 journalists was 1 AP journalist and 1 Reuters journalist, and we find out later that Reuters had actually given the coordinates of their journalists to the Israeli regime, and they've been doing this consistently, and that's just another angle of how the media collaborates with the Israeli military and with the Israeli regime. But even in reporting these strikes, they use Israeli spokespeople as fact that they were targeting a surveillance camera. So it's okay. It's okay that they killed a number of people. It's okay that they killed journalists. It's okay that they target a hospital. They were targeting a Hamas surveillance camera, as if that merits 4 missiles. The last thing I'll touch on is, we talk about all this bias and we always think, well, what are journalists in these newsrooms doing? What are they doing? We always think that they're not doing anything. And in many cases, they are not doing anything. The minimum we could do is just speak up. But there are a lot of journalists who are trying to push back, trying to cover for more accurate coverage of the genocide in Gaza. And I spoke to some of them. I did an investigation for PRISM and Visualizing Palestine. If you're interested, this is some of the material that we produced. I spoke to at least 12 journalists of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim heritage, and at least 1 American journalist, all working in major newsrooms, progressive newsrooms, international newsrooms that are based in the United States. And they all talk to me about how they are being censored in the newsroom, whether if they were quoting the word ethnic cleansing or apartheid as a quote of someone had said it, they are told to remove that. If they have family in Gaza that were killed in front of their colleagues, they are asked, why are you so moody? Can you be objective when you go on air? For others, the censorship was more violent. They were completely taken off assignments. If they were to pitch anything related remotely to Arabs, not even Palestinians, they would be accused of trying to write about Palestine just because their name resembles an Arab name or the topic resembles something related to Palestine. One journalist was told there was before October 7 and there's after October 7. So the standard has risen in terms of what you can and cannot report. There are other examples of freelance journalists like Iman Muhammad, who is a Palestinian journalist from Gaza. She's a photojournalist who was in the US recently, who was basically cut off from major organizations like NPR and the Wall Street Journal for an entire year. They didn't give her any assignments, did not respond to her, killed her stories. And after 1 year, when their editors shifted internally, they reached out to her and said, hey, we'd like you to do this story for us. So I'll stop here. عشان ما أخذ وقت كتير. But these are just, brief overviews and examples of the type of violence that takes place inside and outside of the newsroom when it comes to covering Palestine.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much for that deeply engaging presentation. And I'm sure that your fellow panelists will be able to connect with that. So I invite next to speak Diana, lawyer and analyst Diana Butu.
Thank you. I want to first start off by thank you for organizing this. And then secondly, by saying that I'm very humbled to be amongst such great giants. I'm the person who shouldn't be on this panel because I'm not a journalist. I'm not a person who has had to deal with the day-to-day behind the scenes work of editors, of what to cut, what not to cut, of the language that's used, and the violence of having to deal with the everyday, the micro, the macro of what it's like to be a journalist in these major corporations. So I thank you for inviting me, and again, I thank you for putting me amongst such giants, such as Leila, Professor Samuel Arian, and Laura. So thank you very much. I want to confine my remarks to my experience living in Palestine and working with journalists, both Western journalists as well as Palestinian journalists, and hoping that my remarks will reflect just my personal experience of what it's like to see and witness how Western media has been complicit in this genocide. And I think it's important to step back and recognize that Western media complicity didn't just start with this genocide. The Western media has been complicit with Israel's war crimes for quite some time, for many, many, many years. And there are a number of reasons. There are a number of reasons that deal with the geopolitical. There are a number of reasons that deal with racism. But there are also a number of reasons that are structural, and it's those structural reasons that I want to get into. The first reason that I have seen is that Western media fundamentally don't view Palestinian journalists as journalists. From the examples that I have seen working with Palestinian journalists and working with the Western media, is that Palestinian journalists are often told that they're not allowed to be Palestinian. So they're not allowed to explain what it is like to live as a Palestinian. They're not allowed to share their experiences. They're not allowed to express any views whatsoever on a brutal military occupation or about an ethnic cleansing process that has erased their families, that has erased their homes, and that continues to do the same. This is even predating what Israel's doing in the genocide since 2023. And it's for this reason, this view that Palestinians are not allowed to be journalists, that we've seen that over time, whenever a Palestinian does express any form of political opinion, that we get organizations like Honest Reporting. And for those of you who don't know what Honest Reporting is, there's nothing honest about Honest Reporting. Honest Reporting is a US-based media organization that claims to want to bring honesty to US reporting, but instead specifically goes after Palestinian journalists to try to get these journalists fired. They do so by doing everything by going after their tweets, to their Facebook posts, to the ways in which language is used, to going after Western journalists themselves, to trying to do everything to silence Palestinian voices, whether those voices are Palestinian or whether those voices are Palestinians writing the stories, or whether those stories are coming through Western journalists. And so the effort has been for quite some time, for many, many, many years, to try to get rid of Palestinian journalists. And we've seen what the results have been, that over time there has been a decline in the number of Palestinian journalists who are reporting on Palestine. The exception, of course, is in Gaza. And the reason that Gaza is the exception is because it is so difficult for Western media to actually make it into Gaza. And it's for this reason that Western media has had to rely on Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Fast forward to the year 2023, when we see the systematic targeting by the Israeli army of these Palestinian journalists, and suddenly all of those old structures are once again brought into play. And you can see exactly what happened, particularly in the aftermath of October the 7th, when so many Palestinian journalists were suddenly labeled as Hamas. By the way, the distinction should be combatants versus civilians, not Hamas. So suddenly they were labeled Hamas, and Western media, rather than interrogating, rather than challenging, rather than questioning the Israelis over any of these classifications, rather than challenging them as to whether they should be viewed as targets, instead just somehow seem to accept it. Once again, fundamentally, because they don't view Palestinians as journalists. They view them as somehow stenographers, what's actually quite the opposite. The second structural reason that I've seen over the years that that media has been complicit is particularly because of the closure and because of the regime that the Israelis have placed in Gaza, the blockade and the closure regime that predates October of 2023. It's been very difficult for journalists to make it into Gaza. And for this reason, there were no Western journalists in Gaza in October of 2023. The pressure that Western journalists have been pushing for and what they've been demanding since October 2023 is access into Gaza. And they've done so by filing a number of lawsuits before using the Israeli court system, somehow viewing that the Israeli court system is separate and apart from the Israeli government. And what they've been granted by the Israeli government is the crumbs of being embedded. And many of these journalists have rushed to accept these crumbs of being embedded. So rather than these journalists, once again, questioning why it is that they are being allowed to go in simply where they're being monitored the entire time, where their footage is monitored, where their words are monitored, where everything they do is monitored, rather than questioning and refusing to adopt that, instead, because they've accepted these crumbs, you see much of the reporting that has come out from these journalists has been absolutely horrifying. And I want to bring it back to the ways in which we've seen the opposite case and the ways in which Western media has treated Israeli journalists, which has been the exact opposite. One of the things that has been remarkable is in the aftermath of October of 2023, we saw that with the targeting of these Palestinian journalists, that alongside that, there was a surge in the hiring of Israeli journalists. And alongside this surge in the hiring of Israeli journalists, there was no pushback to say this person ended up tweeting this, or this person wrote that, or this person said this, or they've done that, or they went to the army, and so on. And I want to give a couple of examples. The first example that I want to give is that of Hassan Islayah. Hassan Islayah was a freelancer who worked for CNN. He had worked for CNN for a number of years. Honest Reporting went after Hassan, claiming that he was directly involved in October of 2023. Allegations which were entirely false, allegations which nobody were not only false, but they'd never proven to be true. But on the basis of just the mere allegations, he was fired from his job at both AP as well as at CNN. And on the basis of these allegations, Hassan was targeted by the Israeli army and injured. And while he was receiving treatment in a hospital, the Israeli army then targeted the hospital again, killing him and killing others as well, while he was in a hospital. So again, hitting two things that are illegal, hitting journalists as well as hitting a hospital. Now, on the flip side is CNN, the same organization that quite literally put him in the crosshairs, has since hired a woman who is a person who trains people on how to drive an armored tank. And not only does she train people, but in December of 2023 is seen posing with a number of tanks. And in her tweet says that she has a soft spot for the tanks. Again, there's no pushback for CNN against this woman, Tal Shalev, for going and being in the Israeli army, for going into an army that is a genocidal army. And yet when it came to Hassan, there were literally crosshairs put on him. The second example that I want to give is that of Anas Sharif. Anas Sharif was, as Laura had already mentioned, he was put on one of the lists that the Israelis put out. Again, there was no pushback by Western journalists of why is it that there is a target list. And when he ended up being targeted and assassinated, which he knew he was going to be assassinated, and we all knew that he was going to be targeted and assassinated, instead of there being outrage by these journalists, we instead saw that Israeli journalists were cheering this and came out and tweeted and came out on newscasts and said how happy they were that Anas Sharif had actually been targeted. You can only imagine the outrage had it been the other way. And so this is all to say that when it comes to anything that comes out of the mouth of Palestinians, whether it's a tweet, whether it's a Facebook post, you name it, is somehow subjected to massive scrutiny. And yet, no matter what it is that the Israelis do, it's not subjected to that same scrutiny at all. And because the same dehumanization that we've seen reflected in the newspapers and on these newscasts actually runs very deep. And it's because at their core, the dehumanization runs deep. It's not just on the level of the output, it's actually at the level of the input. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Diana, for your very powerful structural analysis. And of course, speaking to how Palestinian journalists by Western media upsettingly keep being framed wrongly as well as non-journalists. I would like to now just open the panel to executive producer of Al Jazeera English Fault Lines, Leila Al-Arian.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Siga, to inviting me to participate in this important discussion. It's really an honor to be with my fellow panelists who I've already learned so much from and who I respect so much for their important work. I think it's important that we acknowledge, even as we take part in this webinar, the genocide in Gaza continues to unfold in the most horrifying ways possible. This is day 718 of the Gaza genocide. Israel continues to indiscriminately attack, slaughter, maim, displace, and starve the people of Gaza. And as Laura mentioned, as Israel continues its systematic campaign of eliminating the truth tellers and the eyewitnesses and those on the front lines covering this genocide as journalists, they are able to commit these crimes in the dark as more and more journalists are killed. As Laura mentioned again, the numbers of upwards of 280 Palestinian journalists, the highest number by far killed in modern history. I've lost 10 of my Al Jazeera colleagues, including some of whom have already been mentioned, Anas Sharif, Mohammed Salama, and so many others. And it wasn't in crossfire. It's not as people think. Again, it's part of a systematic campaign to silence the people who are documenting genocide in real time. As has already been mentioned, Gaza has been closed to international media, so that burden of covering the genocide has fallen on the shoulders of Palestinian journalists, frankly, those best suited to cover it anyway. But there's been a stunning lack of solidarity shown to them from people in my industry, the media industry, particularly in the West. Not only that, there have been moments and horrifying examples of Western media acting in complicity in terms of putting targets on their backs and even justifying the murders of Palestinian journalists and their family members. I will never forget in October 2023, just days after the wife and children of Al Jazeera's longtime Gaza correspondent, Wael al-Dahdouh's family, were targeted and killed in their home. We all saw the footage of Wael finding out the horrifying news, keeping his press vest on and continuing to report even after. The New Yorker magazine smeared him and his fellow journalists in Gaza as Hamas propaganda simply for reporting the genocide and the mass killing of their people. Anas al-Sharif, as both Diana and Laura mentioned, was Al Jazeera's correspondent in the north of Gaza. He actually had an opportunity to leave Gaza on multiple occasions, including in the days leading up to his murder, but he never wavered in his commitment to telling the story of the people of Gaza. He actually won a Pulitzer Prize, not many people know this, for his photography for Reuters. How did Reuters cover his killing? They had a headline that said, "Israel kills Al Jazeera journalist it says was a Hamas leader." Now, this claim is absurd. It's verifiably untrue. We know that Anas was a journalist. We know that Israel's smears were never proven. They never provided any evidence beyond fuzzy screenshots that were clearly fabricated that Anas was anything but a journalist. We all saw him practically 24/7 on Al Jazeera's air. But rather than actually take a moment to pause and report out Israel's smears, knowing this was a person who they won a Pulitzer Prize, the highest prize in journalism in the West, they simply mindlessly regurgitated this smear even before Anas's body went cold. These journalists, in my experience, having worked directly with them, have the highest level of professionalism, of courage, of commitment to the profession and the craft. Laura mentioned the absurd example of Screams Without Words, the front page story on the New York Times that was published in December 2023, alleging that mass rape took place by Hamas on October 7th. Of course, every claim, every witness was debunked and discredited in that front page article. The New York Times refused to retract it, despite this piece completely falling apart. And yet, when you deal with the journalists of Gaza, you see the utmost level of professionalism in their work. We made a film, Peabody award-winning film called The Night Won't End, also nominated for an Emmy, that chronicled and covered in great detail Israeli killings of civilians in Gaza, from including the killing of 5-year-old Hind Rajab. At the time we were investigating for this film, allegations of point-blank executions by Israeli ground troops in Gaza in December of 2023. And we'd heard a number of these horrifying incidents when Israeli troops would go into Palestinian homes and execute at point blank civilians, including a pregnant woman, including 11 men in the case of one building on December 19th, 2023. So I was working with a local journalist in Gaza named Abdul Qadir Sabbah, who'd been investigating some of these accounts. And he was looking at a specific incident of the Khalidi family that took place in December 2023. And he told me, I showed up and I started looking for witnesses to interview. And I didn't speak to a neighbor because he had only heard, but he didn't see for himself the execution. So it just shows you the high standard by which these journalists hold themselves. Meanwhile, they're smeared, as Diana mentioned, as unreliable narrators or unreliable chroniclers of their own genocide, when in fact, they are so much more professional and hold themselves to much higher standards from the Western journalists that we've seen outright fabricate or outright carry water for Israel's propaganda campaigns. In my remaining time, I wanted to quickly go through some of the structural problems that we've seen with Western media coverage of the genocide. I'm not myself a media critic, but I've been forced into this position as a journalist because the media, particularly the Western media, has been so complicit in the manufacturing of consent for genocide and its coverage over the past 2 years. And these are just some of the ways in which they've done that. First, I want to say that I don't intend to paint the entire Western media with a broad brush. There are people in these newsrooms who are trying their best. Laura spoke to some of these people for her article. They've tried to encourage their managers and their editors to do better. What I'm talking about are the structural issues in these institutions that have carried water for Israel and manufactured consent, mostly the leadership that have been calling the shots and leading the coverage. The media coverage of the genocide has been likened to the Iraq War, weapons of mass destruction debacle, laundering disinformation. And there's a circular nature of this disinformation. So, for example, when you see, as Laura mentioned, the beheaded babies, then you hear the president of the United States. By the way, it's not just Biden. Trump the other day talked about seeing photos of beheaded babies, which we know never happened. So this continues to be having this circular nature. Similarly, we've seen this in both administrations. When the Western media will report something, they'll say, similar to the Iraq War coverage or the coverage preceding the Iraq War, we heard this from, unnamed officials. The government then says, well, we saw this in media reports, and then you just never even know what the provenance of this disinformation is, other than that it's coming from the Israeli state. The coverage of the genocide amounts to don't believe your eyes and don't believe your ears. We've seen it every day. We've seen the daily horrors in Gaza. We've seen it normalized for 2 years, whether it's beheaded babies, actual beheaded babies in Gaza, people's bodies shredded by new weapons that Israel's testing on the people of Gaza, systematic rape, use of rape in prisons and in detention, the kidnapping of Palestinian hostages, now numbering in the thousands. And yet none of that is treated as a newsworthy story. It's simply glossed over. Daily, upwards of 100 Palestinians are being killed in Gaza. Again, it's not treated as breaking news. It's simply normalized. We've seen systematic campaigns, propaganda campaigns run by the State of Israel that have influenced the media coverage, or frankly, lobbyists for the State of Israel. This goes back to October 2023, when we saw a campaign to call the Gaza Health Ministry the Hamas-run health ministry, which continues to this day. News organizations are continuing to use this phrasing of Hamas-run health ministry simply to try to cast doubt on the death toll, even though the death toll is likely a far undercount, on anything that comes out of the Ministry of Health there. Israel has, obviously, we've talked about, repeatedly been caught fabricating or lying. As Diana mentioned, this goes back decades, but even as recently as 2022, when the Israeli military lied repeatedly about the circumstances of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, my Al Jazeera colleague. If any other source had been lying so consistently and so blatantly, journalists would start to question that source and perhaps choose to report out the claims of that source. And yet the Israeli military and government remain a trusted source by the Western media, so much so that even when the claims are clearly patently absurd, they make headlines. They're put front and center. And we've noticed that in these propaganda campaigns, they often come at very sensitive moments in the genocide. So, for example, the very moment that the ICJ was releasing their decision that Israel was committing plausible genocide in Gaza, what do we see? A massive media campaign, and the media dutifully adopting this campaign and putting it on their front pages, smearing the UNRWA, or the UN Relief and Works Agency, that it had a role on October 7th. So again, in order to deflect attention from this historic ICJ ruling that Israel is committing plausible genocide in Gaza, instead what you see is the media running wall-to-wall coverage with the smear campaign. By the way, a few months later, acknowledging that actually there's no evidence to back up these claims. But the damage has been done, and that's the intention of these campaigns. We also see language that seeks to minimize Israel's crimes in Gaza, crimes which are, written in international law as crimes. So ethnic cleansing, a plan to forcibly displace Palestinians is called audacious or brazen, not illegal and inhumane and immoral. We saw the same kind of language as Laura mentioned with the pager attacks, amazing, ingenious, eye-catching. To call attacks that have literally killed children, maimed them, and blinded people eye-catching is just adding insult to injury. And then we also see a refusal to use the word genocide, even as there's broad consensus from every genocide scholar, every human rights organization, even the UN, saying that this is a genocide, continuing to refuse to use that language. In fact, The Intercept early on in the genocide reported that the New York Times's style guide, officially discourages the use of words like ethnic cleansing, like occupied territories, like even Palestine or refugee camp. So this is not just a practice that journalists are doing. It's actually literally written into their style guide. We've also seen a use of passive voice, like lives ended in Gaza, that deliberately omits the perpetrator. I mean, this has become just a meme at this point, or, very well known for anybody who consumes this media. Asal Rad, has very effectively on Twitter called this out repeatedly, just the complete refusal to name Israel as the perpetrator, using passive language, minimizing the famine by saying famine in quotes, even though the famine has been acknowledged as a famine by every major institution whose job it is to acknowledge it, calling Palestinians prisoners, but Israelis hostages. So the use of language is something that has long been acknowledged to kind of aid in this dehumanization and minimization of the horrors taking place in Gaza. We also see emotive language when it comes to talking about Israel: massacre, slaughter, barbaric, monstrous, whereas it's very neutral and detached language when talking about the suffering and mass murder of Palestinians. And then we even see very prominent examples of journalists in the Western media expressing horror about October 7th. Abby Phillip, the CNN presenter, tweeted, "Don't look away," about the fictitious story of beheaded Israeli babies. She's never said anything about the killing of Palestinian children, but she tweeted, "Don't look away," and never apologized for doing that, by the way. We've seen journalists crying, showing emotion about the killing of Israelis, and zero emotion about the killing of Palestinians, zero care. Because at the end of the day, as Diana mentioned, this is about the dehumanization of Palestinians. It's about the normalization of Palestinian death. All of these blatant, examples of systemic omissions, systemic bias, what that does is create a narrative that seeks to normalize the killing of Palestinians, their displacement, their ethnic cleansing. And what this has unleashed and the impact it's had is a serious crisis of audience trust in these media institutions. So I know of young journalists who have zero interest in working for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, for CNN, and frankly, young audiences who have completely turned away from these media institutions because they're simply not deemed credible anymore because of these biases. And I think they have a long way to go in regaining that trust. But more than that, there needs to be a process of accountability for their role in this genocide and manufacturing consent for it.
Thank you so much, Leila, for your very powerful, no doubt, and multi-layered analysis of the structural problems that are creating or making this, as you put it, I think, this stunning lack of solidarity more apparent. And yes, I'm just so very moved by all these presentations, to be quite honest. I am left with so much to think about here. But before we open up for discussion, I would just like to now open the general discussion, open up the panel to a director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, Professor Sami Al-Arian.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul, for moderating this session. And I want to thank also my three co-panelists for excellent and very thoughtful presentations. Media and journalists, and journalism in particular, are very important at times of war because they are the eyes and ears of the public. The public is not there to see. The government's trying to manipulate information coming out of these war zones in order to keep the public supporting of whatever atrocities are taking place. And there is no doubt that what the Zionist regime is doing in Gaza is just simply that. But before I continue with this, I just want to also note the historical nature of what's happening in Gaza today. In World War II, over a 6-year period from 1939 to 1945, the number of journalists who were killed were 69. That averages almost once a month or even less than that. In the Vietnam War, which was a 20-year war from 1955 to 1975, the number of journalists, and we're talking about millions of people being killed there, the number of journalists who were killed during that was 63. That averages about one every 4 months. Even if you go to the Ukraine war, which is still going on, talking about now about 3.5 years of this war, the number of journalists who were killed were 17. That's about one every 2.5 months. In the last 6 months, nobody was killed who was a journalist. Now, when you turn to Gaza, and we're talking about 719 days, that's less than 2 years. And you look at the number of journalists, as Laura pointed out, it's about 280. And has that been the majority of them at one period, by mistake? No, that's consistent. If you go from day one, I tweeted twice about this, once in January 2024 and once in April 2025. That's about 5 months ago. It's almost the same rate. When you look at journalists, the average would be not 1 month, not 2.5 months, not 4 months, about 60 hours. Every 60 hours, you're talking about one journalist being targeted and killed. And it's even worse than that. Those journalists who were killed in previous wars, they were targeted or maybe mostly by mistake because they were in a war zone. Here we're talking about not only targeting the journalists and media people, even their own families. Every one of them lost sons and daughters and wives and uncles and fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers. We're talking about all families being wiped out. And most of the journalists in the past who were killed in war zones, because most female were not allowed in war zones, they're mostly female, mostly male. Now we're almost, equally likely that you could be a female and still targeted. The other day, the 5 journalists who were killed, we know she was reporting just moments ago before she was targeted because of what? A camera surveillance. So we have to understand that this is a quite different from any other human experience when it comes to targeting journalists or dealing with war zones. The second point I would like to make, which has to do with the context. I think it's very important to understand why is Israel doing what it's doing, and why is America covering for it? Why is America complicit in this genocide? Why are the media outlets and the media conglomerates, and we're talking about media institutions which are putting their reputation as the panelists pointed out, on the line? Why are they doing what they're doing? Because simply they can't open to the truth. If the truth was to be told to Western audiences, and now, of course, this is, for them, it's a disaster. We're talking about PR disaster because of social media, because of those journalists, even though they were in Palestine, mostly Palestinians, they took the sacrifices, they took the risks in order to tell the people what's actually going on. When we look at massacres, whether it was Rwanda, whether even at the time of the Holocaust, people think that the Americans and others, we're talking about the public, knew exactly what's going on in the Nazi concentration camps. No, they didn't. Most of that came after the war. This is the only genocide probably that is happening before the people's eyes every single day. Layla pointed out that there's about 100 Palestinians killed today, you know, that about 70,000 with the missing ones. These are the confirmed ones. We know from sources, even within the Israeli medical community, that they think the number of people who have been either killed or wounded, not wounded, but killed and missing, probably upwards of 200,000. We're talking about a massive number of people in the most concentrated place on earth. If Gaza 365 kilometers square, that's sometimes even less than a big town. We're talking about people who are there without shelter, without food, without hospitals, without any aid whatsoever, because Israel has cut off aid from day one, and there was trickling in. And now since March, almost we have famine and starvation taking place. That's in the midst of a genocide. I mean, you can't even imagine this. If you had somebody who was a person who's making a movie, they probably wouldn't think of worse horror that anybody could go on. And that's the context here. And yet they go after journalists because they don't want this story to be told every single day. And as Sharif was putting his life on the line, he was putting his soul or his, you know, in his hand, knowing that he could be targeted anyway. And he wrote his will as many others, because they know that they have no place to go, but they insisted on reporting the story, which shows the type of people these journalists are. The American context also is even worse. You know, I remember when the first time a Shifa hospital was hit, what did Biden, how did he react to this? Oh, it wasn't from our team. Our team. He's talking about their team. He thinks that he's part of this. And when he went to Israel the first time, he was leading the discussion. He was sitting at the head of the table leading the discussion as the others were discussing. The whole discussion was conducted in English. What are we going to do about this? That's more than being complicit. That's being part and parcel of it. And did that change? That hasn't changed. That hasn't changed with Trump. Trump is just even worse than Biden. And of course, both of them were completely part of this genocide. That's a story also that is being ignored by Western media, because it gives not just responsibility and not just gives, because that means the whole country is complicit. That means every single American is complicit in the genocide. And that's a very tough story to tell. So that's why they want to cover, because they don't want to shock the conscience of the people. And yet, when you look at young people and how 2 years of this genocide, how the whole situation of Palestine, Israel has transformed now. In the latest poll, the number of, and they were talking about now the average man in the street, the average woman in the street, the percentage of those who sympathize with Palestine for the first time in history has exceeded the number who sympathize with Israel. And if you go down, and this is across all ages, but if you go down under 30 or 35, you'll find there is overwhelming support, even among Republicans, and really revulsions against what's happening. So yes, we can take actually comfort, if one could say that, from the fact that this is not going to go unaccountable. This is not going to go without people holding them accountable. If not now, certainly in the future. If not actually in a courtroom or some trials, certainly people no longer respect not only the Zionist regime, but even their own government in America, even the US government today. You know, yesterday Trump was talking about free speech. I mean, it's ironic that he's the one who prevented the Palestinian delegation from coming and talking before the whole world while they're members of the UN. He wouldn't issue them a visa, and they're talking to the whole world about free speech. I mean, what kind of sociopath people we're dealing with here? The third point, or the fourth point, has to do with the implication. And the implication is very important, because that means if the world is allowing this to take place, they are allowing not just women and children and a whole city being basically destroyed, but we're talking about professions such as journalists and medical staff and teachers and professors and universities. Then we no longer have any rules. It's not just the rules of war. Any kind of international order is gone. That's huge, because that means on one side that whatever the world played with, whatever international rules and norms, whatever international conventions existed that basically organized the world, no longer apply. Where does that take us? What is the future? What will be the future? And the US can no longer actually claim anything. It's gone. Its leadership, if that even a proper word to say, is no longer valid. And I think for the most part, the media has been covering this fact because the implications are severe in many ways, in many instances. The other point that it's very important to note is the fact that when you talk about genocide and ethnic cleansing, these are the worst crimes that humanity could see. This is something, there is no worse than a genocide. So if you cover a genocide, that means there is no moral fiber that you can talk to. I mean, you can talk about. When we talk about, this is the most moral army in history, it's a joke. And people know it's a joke. And therefore, that puts the whole project, the whole Zionist project on the scale. They put it on the line. That people can no longer look at Israel in this prism of that they could get some sort of a pass, because this is no longer the case. They have crossed every red line that you can think of, and they have done every crime that anybody can even imagine. And therefore, I think the future, even though it's bleak now, even though it's very painful and horrifying, but over the long term, I believe that the Israel project, the Zionist project, is finished. It can no longer have a narrative that would be convincing. And I think over time, and if there's a silver lining here, is that those journalists did not die in vain. Those journalists, through their sacrifices, through their reporting, they told the whole world, they exposed to the whole world the nature of Zionism, the nature of the Zionist state, the Zionist regime, what kind of a threat to civilization, to humanity they represent. And I think that has been shown, and I think they're trying to cover it. They're trying to declare some sort of an absolute or total victory, but that they will never come through because they have already been defeated by their own hands by committing all these crimes, all these atrocities. And the whole world now can see it. And those who don't see it, they will see it, because what they're doing is just they're trying to cover their eyes with something and put it in front of them. But once that is gone, they can see what it means today to be a Palestinian and what it means today to be an Israeli. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Adian, for your very comprehensive analysis, as always, of course. And perhaps there is about 20 minutes left. Perhaps with the remainder of time, we can do something of a ping-pong discussion, just to open it up to the panelists to speak to one another on perhaps anything they want to speak to that their fellow panelists said during their presentation. I mean, perhaps I could just open it up with the question. Dr. Al-Adian mentioned something very pointed, I think, and maybe this could just start things off. Why are they, the media, why are they doing what they're doing? Why this systematic censorship, dehumanization of Palestinians? Why is it being done, in whose interests? If perhaps anyone wants to take it from there, or feel free to begin the discussion any way you like.
Maybe I'll begin so I loved his analysis because it's looking at it from the big picture of the way that it is structurally in the United States, and I fundamentally agree with it. And I want to add some personal experiences of what it's like being in Palestine and seeing it from up close. And up close, what it looks like is that many of these journalists come in with a lot of racism. I want to be clear in the way that Leila and Laura, everybody's been clear in saying I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush, because not everybody should be painted with the same brush. But there is a lot of racism. And that racism comes from everything from looking at Palestinians as totally different because they've been conditioned to understand Israel and to understand Israel to equal the West. There's a lot of there's a lot of Islamophobia. And in addition to the anti-Arab racism, anti-Palestinian racism, and Islamophobia, there's also there's also been a conditioning to love Israel. So things like whenever Palestinians say something, it's always questioned. And I've been with journalists where you can see that a Palestinian will say something, it's like they're questioned and questioned and questioned and questioned, especially when Palestinian hostages, because they are hostages, when they're released from prison and other places, just the intense questioning, like the people who are from questioning of people who've just been through trauma, and like on and on and on and on and on, and trying to find some sort of gap in their story, where that same interrogation is not done when it comes to Israelis. And it doesn't even have to be in terms of trauma, but in terms of anything, that no matter what it is that Palestinians say, it always has to be backed up with facts. It has to be backed up with figures, with you name it. And any slip is somehow not considered right. And that really is like, that's a form of their racism that is internalized. We see this all the time in Palestine, that Israelis are given a pass and Palestinians are not. And here's an example. In the years, I'm not talking months, in the years leading up to October of 2023, so many Israelis would express deeply racist statements. Israeli politicians were deeply racist statements. Things like the Palestinians should have their heads chopped off, that they should be thrown into the sea, that Palestinians only remained because David Ben-Gurion didn't finish the job. This is predating. I mean, these are years before that Palestinians are moving in droves. I mean, like all of this racist statement, and journalists after journalists after journalists from Western news outlets, very reputable Western news outlets, would dismiss it to me with a sleight of hand, like, oh, that's just Israelis being Israelis. And you can imagine that if it had been Palestinians who had said 1/10 of the statements, the reaction that would have been. So yes, I agree that it's like structural. They don't want the Americans to know, but there's also a very deep racism that many of these journalists bring with them when they come to Palestine.
Absolutely. Diana, would anyone like to respond to that?
I wanted to say, there's also, I echo so much of what Diana said about just the structural racism, but also it's important to remember who runs these newsrooms. They're often people who come from very privileged backgrounds, who are very elite, very out of touch with, just regular people consuming the news. Oftentimes, they've actually run in the same circles and socialize with the very people running the country. The policymakers, the politicians, the elected officials. So there's not really much of a gulf between those who run our newsrooms, who run coverage, who draw the red lines in terms of language, what stories can be covered. and the people actually making policy and implementing it. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at the media coverage and wondering why it's so off.
And on that, actually, follow the money. You know, I know a lot of people often, like, especially Palestinians, you know, like we want to talk about the ownership of these organizations, and we should talk about the ownership of these organizations, not just in the United States, but abroad, right? So a lot of the publishers of these legacy media outlets have either billionaires that are supporting Israel behind them, or governments that support Israel. If we're talking about public media, like I guess the CBC in Canada, or Deutsche Welle in Germany, or I don't know what else. So there's a direct editorial line that says you cannot do this or that. We've seen this. I remember watching this clip on one of the, I think it was CBC in Canada, where they had to issue an apology for basically reading a UN human rights report that said the truth about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. But beyond that, if we're looking specifically at the New York Times, and I wrote a little bit about that, so I'm going to reference so that I don't make a mistake. But the board of directors of the New York Times itself has a lot of financial interests in Israel. They have relationships with tech companies in Israel. Even I think the New York Times does have a relationship as well with a social media company in Israel to bolster their, I guess, their reach or their image in the online spheres. So there's a lot of like money exchange relationships between people who are producing the news, who are covering the news, and basically the apartheid state that is housing all these services, that is providing these services for these organizations. But even beyond just who owns it and who doesn't own it, one of the individuals that I actually spoke to, let's talk about advertisers. One of the individuals I spoke to for my piece said that they get a lot of pressure from sponsors that give, that pay for ads on their network to keep up a pro-Israel bias. And there was at least one journalist who told me that one of their sponsors pulled out their sponsorship specifically because they hosted an episode that they deemed was too, anti-Israel. So that happens behind closed doors. We don't hear about it, but it happens behind closed doors. And other than, the ownership that exists, the advertisers that exist in these media organizations, you have the journalists themselves that have an affiliation with the Israeli military. For example, the Writers Against the War on Gaza released a dossier recently that lists, I think, about 20-ish reporters, current or former reporters with the New York Times who have direct ties with the Israeli military. You have the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, who boasts about his time having, dropped out of school so he could go volunteer as an Israeli prison guard, torturing Palestinian prisoners. So, yani, when we're talking about the genocide in Gaza, when we're talking about the occupation of Palestine, our fight for liberation is across so many layers, so many levels, in every industry, behind every door. They are there. They are there with their narrative, with their propaganda, with their ties, with their restrictions. And so on every level, like we need to sort of understand as well, like when these journalists in the newsroom are trying to push back, they're not pushing back against just an ignorant editor or a racist producer. They're pushing back against an entire system that is specifically built to protect the Israeli narrative, to promote the Israeli narrative, and to suppress the Palestinians as inhuman, as demons, as anybody who sympathizes with them or wants to report about them, that they cannot be objective. We don't apply this to any other community. When the BLM protests happened, and there's still a lot of criticisms even there, but when the BLM protests happened, the entire media industry changed the way that it functions so that it could give voice to Black reporters to tell Black stories. Why is it when it comes to the Palestinians, we are not allowed? we're not allowed to speak, we're not allowed to report, we cannot be correct. It has to be our oppressor writing about us, rather than the other way around.
Well, first of all, on the issue of racism, it's very important to know, I think everybody could see it, that Palestinian lives don't matter, Arab lives don't matter, Muslim lives don't matter, not just Black lives don't matter. So for these capitalists or those who are in charge, much of that is the case. That's why you see what you see. It's not just because there is structural problems within themselves. It's a built-in system in which most of the global South, but particularly Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, because of the Zionist influence, they don't matter. That means that now with this genocide taking place, I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching. I've seen countless memes and videos and others in which people are starting to see this impact, that we've been brainwashed. A lot of people are now even questioning 9/11, that so-called global war on terror. That was this a hoax all along? We were just brainwashed into thinking in certain ways, and we just are witnessing a genocide, genocide in real time, live stream 24/7. I think that's important to note. Another thing is also time. I mean, all of you were young or not born when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. I lived that through it, and it was the same agony. The difference is I didn't see it 24/7. I would see it at 6:30 in the news, ABC, CBS, NBC, for about 5 or 10 minutes of reporting. But you could see the same impact. You see bombs going into buildings going down in whole. 77 days, I believe, but 17,000 Lebanese and Palestinians were killed. It was horrifying. And but what you see today is every single day, not just every single day, every single hour, every single minute. And it's just not just bombings from outside. You see starvation, you see kids, you see people not having shelter, being in the streets. I mean, it's everything, coming at once. Every single disaster you can think of, every single calamity, all coming at once. You're being targeted, you're being shot at, you're being sniped at. There's a drones going after you. There's horrifying. There are no hospitals to take your kids. There are no food to feed them. Everything is coming at once. I think that also shocks the conscience of those, if they have an atom of goodness in their heart, they will have to react to it. It's not the same. So those would have a lot of explaining to do. If not now, certainly in the near future, or even in the distant future. They can't get away with this because this is all recorded, which takes me to the third point, which is what is the future of these media outlets? I mean, they lost all credibility to save Zionism, completely lost every single thing. No, who really respects the New York Times or the CNN or I usually read them just out of curiosity to see how they report these things, but I can't take every single claim that comes. I have to go and actually check it out. I can't take anything they say, and then I have to go and think deeply about what they are saying, why they are saying what they're saying. So, what will be the future of these media outlets? Yes, they have been, and I think for a long time they've been owned by the capitalist class, the billionaire class, and I think right now a lot of people are going to question whatever comes out of these, which brings us to the question: what is the role of the media? What is the future of the media? If we no longer have any kind of backbone for the media, what will be the future there? I know that a lot of people have taken it upon themselves, even those who lived through these media outlets, those who were Fox or others, they left it and now they have their own broadcast, and now as if they are seeing the light now. I mean, they were there for dozens of years not knowing, and now they see that there is a whole world of truth that they were never exposed to. Look at the Tucker Carlson of the world and the Candace Owen and Judge Napolitano and others, how they coming now to see that where have we been? What kind of world were we living in? That must have an impact in the future. That will impact not just how people perceive news, but I think what kind of institutions will look at Washington Post after it's been taken over by Jeff Bezos. I mean, they no longer they don't even hide that they are objective, that we're on this side or the side. Of course, with the Wall Street Journal and Murdoch, that's been for a long time, and Fox and so on and so forth. So I think part of what is going to happen as an outcome of the Gaza war and the Gaza genocide is that many institutions that people have thought that they understood, they knew, or they relied on are going to be reconfigured somehow. They have to take another deep look into this. And I would like to pose this actually for our panelists, if they can chip in here, is what do you think the future of the media would be? Are we going to have a new kind of media? Is it going to be really free media? Because we know it's not free media, that this is all hoax. It's, Chomsky wrote doesn't, I mean, what, 30 or 40 years ago about the manufacturing of consent, how the media was being utilized by the imperialist powers. But what would be the future of the media, in your opinion?
I have an answer. If I can, very briefly. Well, thank you for asking that question, because well, there are two things. I think on the rise, movement media, grassroots-led media is growing more and more. Organizations like Prism, Mondoweiss, Dropsite News, they're growing more and more of an audience. It's still an audience that you're preaching to the choir in some ways, but they are doing the work that other organizations are not. And I think people are slowly waking up to that and moving, especially maybe younger audiences. I think the other thing, and I read this the other day, is that entrepreneurial journalism is somehow coming. People are no longer looking at mainstream organizations or media organizations. They're looking to individuals. So I think I don't know how I feel about it, but the idea that people are seeking their news and information from influencers or individuals who are building individual platforms. But even then, there's a downside to that, is how much vetting is going into that. There are particular agendas that are there, right? So sort of, I think we should think more about how can we improve media literacy in audiences to be able to critically consume the news, because I think that's going down. I don't think that's improving at all. People are looking for quick sound bites, for easily understandable, digestible information. They are no longer looking for the truth, and not everyone, obviously, but that's sort of the trend that I'm noticing with people who consume the news. And so I think the media industry itself and journalists themselves, they have to rethink, how do we approach news production in an age that is extremely agile and quick and quickly becoming individualized? How do you build credibility and get resources to be able to produce such news? I don't know, but yeah.
Diana or Leila, did you want to respond to that? We have about 5 minutes, I believe.
I'll say very quickly, I'm worried, actually. So I share your view that they've lost their credibility. They lost it long ago, but I think this is like, Gaza's been the death of so many things in this world, whether it's the international institutions, the idea of media and objective media and so on. But I'm very worried when it comes to the issue of media. I like some of the independent media that has been coming up, but I'm very worried that much of, at least what I see is happening, and the studies are showing, is that people are consuming media through their news through social media. And when you consume your news through social media, it's not always like, there isn't that proper vetting, there isn't that proper analysis, and it's just a question of consuming facts rather than getting analysis. And we see this a lot. The Israelis are brilliant at this. For example, they'll always show you two sides of the exact same video to make it look as though the side where Palestinians are the aggressors, where it's the opposite. They're the ones who are the aggressors. And so this is the type of thing that is very troubling to me, that I worry about the decline of media, and I worry about where it is that we are going. And at the same time, I'm very critical of the fact that the media has done a terrible job in this genocide. One thing that I think is important to say, and I say this every time I speak, genocide is not one of these things where you want a determination after the fact. The whole point of having a genocide determination is so that you can prevent it. And yet all of these news media outlets have been like, oh, well, no, we can't say that it's genocide because there isn't been a legal ruling. But the whole point is to make these determinations so that we can stop it. And if the media hasn't made these determinations in order to stop it, then they've completely and utterly failed. And they have failed during this genocide. They really have failed. And yet I'm still very worried.
Thank you, Diana. Leila.
I think one of my fears about this genocide in general is that somehow we're going to forget. We're going to forget how we feel. We're going to forget the images we've seen. We're going to forget the horrors. And I think we're also possibly going to forget how monumentally the media coverage has failed and has been complicit in this. And I think it's important we don't forget, we document, that people write books. I know there's a few books currently being worked on about this topic, which I hope they do well. And I think there needs to be a process of accountability. There was a very toothless process of accountability, not really accountability, but some media organizations like the Washington Post or the New York Times did issue kind of half-hearted apologies for their horrific coverage leading up to the Iraq War, which that war, as we know, resulted in the deaths of more than 1 million people in Iraq. Not to mention, the region as a whole, many more deaths. But there needs to be a process of accountability. There needs to be studies. There needs to be books written. There needs to be more and more of these conversations in order to make sure that they don't get away with it and that this doesn't happen again. And I share the concern about the future because journalism as an industry is in deep crisis right now in terms of its mere survival. Now, whether it should survive as it is now and as deeply complicit in the genocide is a question, but it's important that we don't forget what happened and that we make sure that there's a process of accountability, apologies, reckoning, and so forth.
I can make just one more point, Paul. I find the point here is that we also are going to see Palestine as being globalized. I think for the first time in the history of this conflict, after almost 8 decades and essentially a quarter of Zionism, Palestine has becoming now the issue that brings all the good people together, all the people who have conscience, who are seeking truth and justice and freedom and peace and all that. And I think this is as a result of what happened in the past 2 years. So these sacrifices are not going in vain. Palestine is becoming the compass, is becoming the scale, the ruler, the key, where all the struggles in the world today are going to be measured against it. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that's going to mean that we may have hit bottom, and from now on, the other side will be on trial. The other side will have to catch up to the not only the graciousness of this cause and the honor of this cause, but also things on the ground. I think we're beginning to see a global movement now. This global movement is not going to rest, not going to forget, as Leila fears or as Diana fears. It's going to continue marching until something is done for the plight of the Palestinians. And it is a credit to the sacrifices of the Palestinians who've never given up and who have never surrendered. So I believe, there are, yes, a lot of things happened the past 2 years, but also there are some very strategic achievements that have taken place. We may not see it now, but it's coming. If I may also, I want to thank the translators who've done a wonderful job. I've been going back and forth, and I want to thank both Omar and Dana for their work and for making this available in Arabic as well as in English. Thank you very much.
Yes, no, thank you as well to the translator Omar and to Laura, Diana, Leila, and Sam, Professor Sami. It's been my privilege and my honor just to be able to facilitate this incredible discussion. And I think I may have mentioned it in an early discussion, hope to maybe transcribe it and make it available to you all, because I hope, for what it's worth, just coming from myself, we can continue these sorts of journalistic solidarity efforts, and build a path forward that continues to illuminate the truth and continues to contest the anti-Palestinian journalism that is out there. So thank you to you all.
It will be available,
Thank
both
you.
versions online on our YouTube
Okay.
channel, SIGA YouTube channel will be
Excellent.
available.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.